Welcome, everybody, to this ESN conversation. We are very glad that you could join us today for this important topic. My name is Bob Truby, and I serve as the director of the Emerging Scholars Network. And we are going to be talking today about a book called Non-Toxic Masculinity, and the author of our book today begins by observing, it's a confusing time to be a man. Men have been the object, usually justly, of the Me Too and Church Too campaigns against sexual abuse, contending on one hand that boys will be boys, and on the other, that not all men, just doesn't cut it for many people. We need to have, many people have a sense of wanting to go for a very different kind of vision of masculinity and a different approach to these matters. And Zach Wagner is going to be talking a little bit with us today, particularly about the rise of toxic masculinity in the church, its connection to the purity culture, and what can be done to recover a vision of healthy, non-toxic masculinity. And I've been really looking forward to this conversation with him. Before we begin, just a couple things. We want to remind you that we are recording today's conversation. And if you prefer not to be photographed or recorded during this, leave your mic muted and disable your video. By continuing to participate in the conversation, with your video or audio enabled after the recording begins, you're consenting to allow InterVarsity to use the recording and any screenshots of our conversation for InterVarsity ministry purposes. I'll stop the recording now to allow you to disable your video and audio if you prefer not to be recorded. And I'm very excited to be able to introduce to you Zachary Wagner. He's an ordained minister. He serves as the editorial director for the Center of Pastor Theologians. He's currently pursuing a PhD in New Testament at the University of Oxford. He lives most of the time in Oxford, England, with his wife and 3 children. Today, he's actually calling in from the Chicago area. So, Zachary, we're very happy to have you join us today.
Yeah, delighted to be here, Bob. Thanks so much for the invite. I'm looking forward to the conversation and interaction.
Thank you for joining the conversation today. We want to start. Your book focuses on the influence of the purity movement on toxic versions of masculinity within the church. I wonder if you could explain your decision to focus on this subculture rather than the wider cultural situation around masculinity.
Sure. Yeah, I think it relates really to my story. You know, I grew up very much in the thick of kind of conservative white evangelicalism, spent a lot of time in my youth and youth discipleship in multiple influential megachurches, so also the megachurch movement in and around the Chicago area. And if you were to guess what some of those churches were, you'd have a pretty good chance of guessing correctly what churches I was part of. And then moving on in my life through higher education, theological education, and now I'm pursuing a DPhil at Oxford. And I've also been married now for 9 years. The choice to even write this book in the first place was a function of what I think I and many people were seeing happening within not just the broader cultural conversation around Me Too, but the Christian subculture. So this is one big bucket of why it came to this project. And a crisis point in the subcultural conversation for me had to do with the Atlanta spa shootings in early 2021, which some people may recall. Specifically that this shooter went around to different massage parlors in the Atlanta area and targeted women primarily of East Asian descent, and killed, I believe, 6 women or 7 women, if I'm not mistaken. And then later, after he's arrested, he's being interviewed by the police, and they're asking him, of course, about his motive for this shooting spree. And what he said in response was, well, I'm a sex addict, and I was providing a public service by eliminating my temptation. And then it comes out kind of in the coverage the next couple of days that this young man, was a baptized member of a Southern Baptist church. And that really stuck with me and stuck kind of buried deeply into my soul and my mind, I guess you could say, as I was processing this, because that language of viewing women as temptation and kind of personifying women around that, and viewing the mission of avoiding sexual sin as a mode of avoiding women. And this guy had taken this to a logical extreme where he actually acted out in violence against women and murdered them. That disturbed me because it was, in a perverse way, coherent with the mode of thinking about sexual integrity, sexual purity, if you want to use that language, that I had been reared on in what people now these days will often call purity culture within the Christian subculture that this young man also grew up in. So that's kind of bucket number one. I know this is a little bit longer answer, but it kind of, I think, sets up a lot of the conversation. Bucket number two, as it relates to purity culture, is what some people have described as the sexual prosperity gospel that was very common within resourcing and discipleship and events in the late 90s, early aughts, which is this idea that if you, quote unquote, save yourself, if you follow God's rules, God's vision for human sexuality, and don't participate in the, you could call it the promiscuity culture that is in the wider culture, God will reward you not only with marriage down the line, but with a happy, safe, secure, shame-free experience of sexual intimacy in that marriage. So it is a pay your dues of self-control now in view of your best sex life later. And as that panned out in my own life, you know, my now wife and I, and she's very open about this and, you know, kind of happily endorses me sharing fairly openly about our relationship and her story, which is an important caveat. But she and I, we did not sleep together before we got married, nor with anybody else, and found that the promise of purity culture, of this happy, fulfilling, and free and joy-filled, shame-free, intimate life in marriage on the other side did not materialize for us. And our marriage was characterized by a lot of struggle in this area of our relationship. And two big reasons for that. One is the shame that I was carrying from experiences with masturbation and pornography and the messaging that I had received around male sexuality. And then her, we found out a little bit down the line, we hadn't been thinking in these categories early on, that she's a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. So those things coming together, and the messages that we had received around marriage and, you know, obligation and serving the other person and what sex and marriage can, should, you know, biblically ought to be like, wasn't panning out for us. So those two things, the kind of cultural crisis of Me Too, church to violence against women, and then my story having to do with sexuality and marriage and purity culture, came together to make purity culture the angle that, for me personally, made a lot of sense entering into this conversation. Lots more I could say, but I think that gets at it.
Well, You mentioned your own marriage, and I thought one of the striking things about the book was the vulnerability that you showed about talking about your own marriage with your wife's permission. She actually has she has the first word actually in the book,
Yeah.
uh, uh, in disclosing that this is totally with her knowledge and permission, but and endorsement. But I just thought that was a very interesting choice to be that vulnerable about that,
Mm.
and I wondered how you felt like that contributed to the case that you were making about purity culture.
Yeah, I think um I mean, sexuality is such a vulnerable part of our humanity, and young people's experience, there is this discovery through adolescence and beyond, extended adolescence into young adulthood, and even your 20s or whatever the case may be, where you begin to experience your sexual bodily urges, desires, longings, instincts, whatever you want to call it. But you're also learning how to live out that part of your humanity in a mature way, in a way that is respectful to you, respectful to those around you, and also honoring to God and Scripture and the Christian tradition, for those who identify as part of that. So
Mhm.
um, I think the struggles that so many people have, and questions and difficulties that so many people have in this narrative, take all sorts of different forms. First of all, but it can be so closely tied to the experience of shame. So I think stepping out in vulnerability for me was a way of being honest about something that I think people can sometimes struggle to be honest and forthcoming about, but also, I hope, helping people with similar experiences and struggles and questions and disappointments and stories of suffering and pain, to feel seen and to say, oh, okay, I'm not the only one. This isn't just, I'm not the only person that feels broken in
Mm,
this way, or feels like the messages I received aren't panning out in the way that I thought, and feels disenchanted or frustrated about that, or feels like sex in my marriage is a function of obligation rather than desire, or any number of things that I talk about in the book. So honesty, I think,
mhm.
and vulnerability is the book's been out for a couple of weeks, and it's been a journey, frankly, for me to not only write the thing, which was very emotionally and spiritually daunting, but now to kind of have it out in the world and people reading it and looking at it and presumably forming opinions about it. That's a scary thing, if I'm honest, but I hope that it's in service of driving conversations in a more productive direction that can lead to some changes in the culture and the conversation, and also some healing for folks.
The terminology of purity culture might be very familiar to some of our listeners, and for others, uh, this may not have been part of their experience. Could you just give us a brief sketch of sort of the whole purity movement and purity
Sure.
culture that arose? Just to
Yeah.
set that in context a little bit.
Absolutely. So I talk about this in one of the early chapters of my book, kind of a generational history of purity culture. A tight way of defining it is, purity culture is the discipleship materials, theological kind of assumptions and approaches, as well as events and resources that predominantly white conservative evangelicals produced in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s in response to the sexual revolution. I like how I said that was tight, and then it was like, I
Yeah.
don't know, 5 subordinate structures within that long sentence. But I understand purity culture as a way of commending what I view as historic Orthodox Christian sexual ethics to the generation of young people immediately following the sexual revolution. So it's not it's a cultural movement in response to a wider cultural movement, i.e. the sexual revolution. So I don't associate, as some people do, purity culture with the well, I shouldn't say I don't narrowly associate it with like the belief that sex and marriage go together. That's been Christian teaching for 2,000 years. Purity culture is something that's about a 30-year-old phenomenon, 40-year-old phenomenon. So it's often closely associated with some really popular books, like I Kissed Dating Goodbye is the one that people think of, by Joshua Harris, which was published in 1997. But from the male sexuality perspective, I think really, really influential is the Every Man's Battle series by, oh, I can't believe I'm blanking on this.
Is that Dan
right now.
Allender?
No, it's not Dan Allender.
No.
I
Okay.
have lots of good things to say about Dan Allender.
Okay.
But it's Stoiker and Arterburn. Thank you. I saw that in the
Arterburn.
chat. Stoiker is the one that I had. Arterburn was the one I was dropping. So Every Man's Battle, that series of books, it kind of sprouted. Every Young Man's Battle, don't even get me started, but Every Young Woman's Battle, Every Woman's Battle, this and that, the other thing, all around this kind of sexual purity narrative. That series of books, if I'm not mistaken, has sold over 3 million copies. Whereas the I Kissed Dating Goodbye was a little over 1 million. So massively influential. And then there's also True Love Waits conferences, purity rings, purity balls, all of this. And purity culture, I would say, was characterized by an emphasis on a couple things. One, for young people, holding off on sex until marriage. And then also this promise of sexual joy and fulfillment in marriage down the line. There's a lot more we could say, but I think that summarizes a bit of what the purity movement was. I think it peaked, but it's still with us in many ways.
You've already mentioned some of the messaging that was associated with this, and some of the harmful ways that it led to shame in a variety of ways with people and struggles with body image and so forth. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about, you also just discussed how this movement was dehumanizing for both men and women. And I wonder if you might say a little bit more about that and why that's so.
Sure, yeah. So there have been in the past, 6-7 years, a lot of what you might call post-purity culture books, ranging from popular level to academic, scholarly, sociological, historical, whatever the case may be. And then also along an ideological spectrum of people who are not Christians at all, just coming at this from academic lens or social commentary sort of thing. People who grew up evangelical and have very much entered into a post-evangelical space or ex-evangelical or quasi-confessional even. And then people who are within evangelicalism, which is grown to be such a dicey term in and of itself. But something I noticed about these resources is that almost exclusively they have been written by women. And mine is, I was reading with interest a lot of these books as they're coming out, and was finding a lot of help and a lot of things that were creating insights, new insights for me around the way purity culture objectified and dehumanized women by making them sex objects and creating structures around the regulation of women's clothing or behavior or the Billy Graham rule and all of these sorts of things where you leave yourself open to situations of abuse. And when abuse does happen, a lot of times the default can be, well, what did the woman do to precipitate the situation, rather than how can the man be held accountable, and what ways of shaping men in this subculture may have led to this. So there's a lot of rhetoric around the way purity culture was dehumanizing for women. But one of the things I wanted to argue in my book is yes to all of that, but it is also profoundly dehumanizing for men. So if purity culture has a tendency to over-sexualize women's bodies, it has a tendency to over-sexualize men's minds, is one of the things I argue. Or if women are dehumanized and made into sexual objects, men are described in purity culture as sexual, like animals, almost. Like as men's sexual desire is this animalistic urge that's almost a subhuman, visceral thing that is beyond their control. So I think when young men internalize that narrative, it almost freezes us in an immature expression of our sexuality, immature expression of sexual desire, and creates a culture where men are given a free pass for things that they should have grown beyond. And, well, what can you do? Guys being dudes, boys will be boys. Put in this situation, how could you expect a man to act otherwise? Which is pandering and kind of infantilizing men. We're not treating them as moral agents. We're treating them like they're all still 13-year-olds and they just haven't grown up at all. And we're not holding them accountable for living out their sexuality in a mature, adult, and conform to the image of Christ, rehumanized way, not only in the way that they think about themselves, humanizing themselves, dignifying themselves, but also in the way that they humanize and relate to others in a way that is honoring of their creation in the image of God.
Well, we have a few more minutes before we take a break to talk about your book. I want to ask you about, you offer a strong call for men to be the change in this.
Yes.
That there's an important place that men need to exercise agency in being the change, particularly toward a healthy vision of male sexuality. And what does that mean for you?
Well, it relates to what I was just talking about. I think for men, it's taking ownership of your growth and maturity into adulthood, Christ-likeness, which, by the way, is a growth to true humanity. Jesus is, so I frame this around the story of redemption, particularly in the middle and second half of the book, because I think a lot of these conversations, how does the gospel relate to our sexuality in a purity culture frame? A lot of times it's limited to, well, the gospel means your sexual sins can be forgiven. Because we all have sexual sins, we all have sexual brokenness, but because Jesus and the cross, we don't have to carry the weight and the shame of that anymore. And this is a bit of a sidebar, but I think in certain forms of purity culture, salvation in Christ is almost transposed, whatever the right word there would be, by marriage. Christ is no longer your salvation. Marriage is salvation. Marriage will free you from loneliness, from shame, from you'll attain, pleasure and joy in marriage. And importantly, for men in particular, marriage saves you from sin. And what I mean by that is it saves you from the constant struggle, the daily, every man's battle of a struggle against sexual sin, because marriage creates an outlet, again, pretty dehumanizing language, if your spouse, your partner is your outlet for this animalistic desire. But marriage creates an outlet for non-sinful sexual expression. And so what I wanted to do in terms of men being the change is put this question of male sexuality within a redemptive framework, and think about how the story of the Christ event and redemption ties into these questions in more than superficial ways. So really, really quick, I'll go through and say the creation of men and human beings broadly, but men in particular in the Imago Dei means our humanity is a created good, including all of its constituent parts, including our sexuality. So male sexuality is a created good. It's not at core a destructive thing that's going to destroy the world and destroy you. That is, and a hatred of male sexuality, which I think is not how a lot of men would articulate it, but I certainly would have identified a struggle and hatred towards myself and my sexual desire as a younger person. But that's not a Christian way of thinking about human beings or about human bodies. Sexuality is a created good, number one. And then you think incarnation, the incarnation of the Son of God, second person of the Trinity, as a human male, does not reject the goodness of male sexuality, but reaffirms the goodness of male sexuality. And then Jesus in his life shows that there is a way of living out if you want to use the buzzword, non-toxic masculinity that doesn't dehumanize self by reducing maleness to kind of an animalistic, hypersexual orientation and lens through the world, and also can relate to women, including women you are not married to, as dignified human beings rather than sexual objects. I think Jesus models that for us beautifully. And then the death and resurrection of Christ, our broken sexuality is crucified with Christ. And then resurrection is another thing that doesn't come into this conversation nearly enough, it seems to me. The resurrection is a resurrection to a new type of being human, a restoration towards the path towards true humanity, the ends for which human beings were created. And Jesus shows us in and through the resurrection that our humanity is in process, if we are being transformed into Christ-likeness by the Spirit, in process of being renewed. And a new way to be human means there's a new way to be male. Man, I think that sort of deep work in male identity and situating it in the not just atonement in the sense of sins can be forgiven, but the renewal of humanity in and through Christ by the Spirit is the work that needs to be done to correct this kind of subcultural disease, if you want to call it that.
Well, you just covered a lot of ground, and and I'll tell you, in case folks are wondering about absorbing it all, I would just say, excuse me, get Zach's book, and we'll tell you a little bit about how to get that right now. The book we're talking about today is called Non-Toxic Masculinity, and you can purchase it at InterVarsity Press or other booksellers. But InterVarsity Press is offering a great deal for people on this conversation. If you use the code ESNWEB when you check out, up till May 2nd, you can get a 30% discount on this book and free shipping, which is as good as you can do anywhere else, I think, or better. And so we would just encourage you to pick up a copy of Zach's book, which covers a lot of these things and a lot of things we haven't even been able to get to yet. Zach has some compelling things to say, I think, about fatherhood as part of this, that I'll just give you a snapshot preview of that. And so I would encourage you to check out the book, because it was just a great read. Well, anyhow, we have time now for some audience Q&A. And I think we've had a lot of people, I think, put things in the chat. So we're going to get right to it here. Let me scroll back up to the beginning of those. Okay, Eric poses the question, as we cultivate non-toxic masculinity, do you believe that men-only environments are helpful? In other words, can men's ministry still be helpful in cultivating a healthier vision for masculinity?
Yes, I would say so. I think there is something valuable with some qualifications. And there is something valuable, I think, to gendered spaces and discipleship settings. But I will say the status quo of a lot of church-based discipleship has leaned too far into gender segregation on the one hand, where we kind of unintentionally, I think, and perhaps intentionally sometimes, create a culture of fear and mistrust between sexes when we separate off too much, and, for instance, can't have conversations about sexuality in shared spaces. So it's kind of this, men are dangerous, so we'll put them over there, and women are dangerous too, so we'll put them over there, and if you mixed them, who knows what would happen. That, I think, it can be unhelpful. And the other thing I would caution is that both, I would say, women's only discipleship spaces and men's only discipleship spaces run the risk of leaning too hard into gender stereotypes, where the kind of discipleship groove that men are pushed through is narrow in a way that kind of funnels men into a certain type of temperament and actually fails to celebrate the beauty and diversity within male identity of temperaments. And everyone's kind of put in this like rough and ready, let's watch football and eat bacon and go chop down a tree and ride around in a pickup truck and, shoot shotguns or something like that.
Yep.
And there's a certain amount of men that are gonna have some fun doing that, and that I have nothing bad to say about that. But I will say, saying that that is a model of quote unquote godly biblical masculinity to the exclusion of, in a wild at heart mode, to the exclusion of other ways of being a godly man is something I think can be really unhelpful. So a few comments on that. But I do think there is value still to men talking about, in spaces with other men, what it is like to be a man and pursue God as a man.
Brenda makes a comment here. I appreciate your focus on Jesus as a model for masculinity. In my experience, Jesus doesn't usually play a large role in discussions of masculinity.
Yeah, I will say, but sometimes when he does, unhelpfully so. I think there's a tendency sometimes to remake Jesus in our cultural image of what the ideal man ought to be. So we take really scant details, things like, oh, he was a carpenter, and that means he was tough and worked with his hands, which is, true, probably to some extent. But he also spent like years of his public ministry being a homeless itinerant minister, and being supported by others, including financially by women. So this like manliness, macho Jesus, if I'm honest, I do not see in the New Testament for the most part. And people will be like, oh, well, he got mad and flipped over some tables one time. And like, okay, and you're going to like build Jesus's entire personality as you can read it around this one event, and is like getting mad and flipping over tables like the essence of the model of masculinity that we want to like build male identity around. There's obviously such a thing as godly anger, but I don't think that's the kind of corner of masculinity. Certainly women too can participate in godly righteous forms of anger. And the last thing I'll say about Jesus, for now, if it comes up later, that's just fine, but is that he actually challenges a lot of modern stereotypes associated with masculinity. Not gainfully employed, not married, not don't take this the wrong way, but not like sexually successful, in the sense of he didn't find a woman, marry, settle down, and attain the family sexual ideal that we sometimes view as the ideal in Christian spaces. His masculinity existed in a mode outside of that. And then a last thing I'll say, I already said last thing I'll say once, but this is the last thing I'll say, hopefully. The act of being crucified, it's not so much an act, but having that happen to you in the ancient world would have been considered maximally emasculating. Crucifixion as a form of torture and execution was meant to signal to the watching public, this person is not masculine. They have lost their bodily autonomy. They are being subjected to the power of others, all things that would have been viewed as, if not feminine, certainly emasculating within the kind of the cultural context of the Roman Empire.
Hey, Elizabeth asks a great question here that I know we talked about before the interview started. This may be backing up too far, but can you talk about what authentic, non-toxic masculine identity might look like outside of sexual desire behavior? My own observation is that boys and men across cultures feel the need to achieve maleness, but that often just means being in power over women. And, some of the other aspects, I mentioned bullying and violence, or a propensity toward that.
Yeah, so a couple things. I think particularly for male identity, and the question gets at this, there is a strong emphasis on performance and attainment. The scholarship, it's not directly my field, or tangentially, arguably, my field, but a lot of scholarship around masculinity and masculine identity, you'll see rites of passage and like rituals of attaining to masculinity. In some tribal contexts, you got to go out and you got to kill the boar or something like that, and you come back and the tribe receives you, and you've kind of transitioned from boyhood to manhood or something akin to that. You can imagine different contexts. So I do think it's beyond my pay grade to speculate into the biology and the psychology of it, but you do see that sort of thing come up. And I think in the post-industrial West, a lot of the traditional modes of masculinity and the traditional rites of passage have been, and this isn't a value judgment, but have been shifted and been compromised in certain ways. And I think the reaction, this gets to the question about Jesus previously, in the church has been a turning back of the clock, and rather than pressing into Jesus and saying, what is Jesus in the New Testament teaching us about what godly male identity will be, but instead reading our own kind of nostalgic Victorian 19th century England to 20th century, mid-century America nostalgia into scripture, rather than letting scripture and the Christian tradition challenge us and work potentially against and in rebuke against some of our cultural values of masculinity. So even passages like Ephesians 5 that talk about men, wives and husbands, something that a lot of people want to go to say like male leadership. But I would say, Ephesians 5 does not exhort men to lead, it exhorts men to love. So a masculine identity built around love on the one hand, and two, something that all Christians are exhorted to, like the fruit of the Spirit. So what is a masculine identity? A way of living out male embodiment that is refracted through the Christian virtues, like the fruits of the Spirit. What is a masculinity that's characterized by love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control? I want to see more conversations in that direction. And by the way, that may not look macho and manly and masculine by certain cultural measures, but that's okay. God didn't call men to be more manly. he called men to be like Christ and to be more human. So those are a couple things. And one other thing I'll say is this kind of way that I think the New Testament can turn cultural values of masculinity upside down is really well represented in what Paul says early in 1 Corinthians, that God has chosen the weak things of this world to shame the strong. And man, if that's not a challenge to our cultural values of masculinity, I don't know what is. And that sort of thing has me thinking a lot about what it means to live as a man and as a Christian.
You know, both Peter and Liam mentioned some things about that you've just been addressing, some of the questions around sexuality beyond, or masculinity beyond just sexuality and sexual
Yes.
practice. You know, Liam mentioned particularly my comments on fatherhood from your book. And I wonder if you might just say a little bit more about that, because I thought that was actually a very powerful part of your book too.
Sure. Yeah. So it's late in the book. I have this chapter called Fatherhood, the Chief End of Masculine Sexuality, or Male Sexuality, I think is actually what I say there. And I do a little bit of stuff on what's often called the cultural mandate in the early chapters of Genesis, where the Adam, the human being, Ha-Adam, is separated from, I think up to the point in that passage, it's more of a generic human being. And there's a point of separation into male and female in God's image. And immediately following after the separation of Ha-Adam into male and female, you have what is called the cultural mandate, that human beings, men, Adam and Eve, men and women, are called to fill the earth, procreate, and subdue and care for it. So I see that as the kind of sexual separation of humanity as a key to the fulfillment of our mission as human beings in the world. So for men, what that means is our calling is, yes, literally to father children in some cases, though not all cases. You know, as people like, you know, the Lord Jesus and the Apostle Paul make clear, not all men are called to be fathers in a literal sense, but we are all called to be father-like in our disposition towards creation and towards relationships in whatever way God would call us to. So that implies a pretty generous definition of fatherhood. But I think viewing these broader questions around male sexuality through, why did God create this sexual part of me? And I think growing up into that means becoming a father in a variety of ways. That's a little teaser, and I talk more about that in the chapter.
Yeah, please get the book and read that. It's great stuff. And particularly some of the qualities that you think fatherhood really brings out in men. Laurie raises, I think, a really interesting question. As a sociology professor, I'm intrigued by purity culture as an example where the manifest function, promoting godly behavior, and the latent function, dehumanizing men and women, are very much at odds.
Yes.
Do you get
Absolutely.
misheard as saying that pursuing a culture of sexual purity is bad just because purity culture, as we have constructed it, has had perverse consequences? Great question.
Yeah, it is a great question. And, you know, I've been super helped in conversations with some sociologist friends on this, because I think the sociology of the purity movement is absolutely fascinating. And you're right to say that the stated goals of purity culture seem at odds with its actual results in many ways, which is really, really interesting. Just give me a moment to. Can you give me the second half of the question again,
Oh,
please?
sure.
I lost my thought.
Yeah. it was just, do you get misheard as saying that
Yes, thank you.
pursuing a culture of sexual purity is bad
Yes.
just because purity culture has had perverse consequences?
Yeah, so this, I think this is really helpful to separate purity culture as a, I think, social, quasi-political, oftentimes more than quasi-political movement, rather than a theological orientation. There are many kind of critics of purity culture that I think reject both, reject the cultural movements and reject the theological convictions underpinning it. Things like the association between sex and marriage is a huge one, where in order to reject the former, you need to reject the latter. And that's not a view that I take. And for instance, the view that like sex and marriage go together is not, one, limited to the past 30 years of Christian history, nor is it limited to the Christian faith, nor is it limited to people of faith in general. This is kind of the default moral ideal for many cultures throughout human history. So I'm just not convinced that, and I think highlighting that, like this emphasis on sexual purity, and I'm not saying like behavior, like people have been doing sexual things beyond and outside of the ideal always. That's not what we're talking about. But the existence of the moral ideal of chastity outside of and faithfulness within an institution like marriage has been very normal throughout not all, but many cultures in human history. So I'm trying to not be misheard that way, but I think when you critique purity culture, which I do very strongly, some people will hear you that way. And in this book, it's not a book that argues forcefully for a traditional Christian sexual ethic. I think I try to be really honest and forthcoming about, hey, this is where I am. But it is not primarily a book that you would like give to a 18-year-old to say, here's why you should wait until marriage to have sex. That's not what the book is trying to do. It's trying to do, I think, a bit more of a broader theological project than that. I feel like maybe that didn't fully answer the question, but those are some of my thoughts that came up in response.
No. I think you gave us a good sense of both, what you're trying to encourage, what, the views that undergird your thinking, and yet, what you're trying to deal with in this book, which I think is really, really valuable. Hey, this has been really rich, Zach. I have really appreciated just the substance we've been able to pack into a less than an hour, and that's only a portion of what one would find in the book. I wonder if you just have any kind of last words that you want to share before we let people know one more time about the book and how to get it and what's happening next.
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind that is a central theme in the book as it relates to visioning masculinity and certainly discipleship of young people and cultural formation, all of this, is the conviction that I felt was lacking in my kind of upbringing and discipleship around this, is that it really is a good and beautiful thing to be a man. And I think that not only broadly, but specifically with reference to sexuality, like male sexuality is a created good, and it's a wonderful and beautiful thing that is meant to bring life and joy to you as a sexual person, but also to others and to the world. And that was something that was really transformative for me in my thinking on this, that I, so badly, I hope that this book can be part of not just, berating men or saying, y'all got to get your act together, but saying, no, it actually really is a beautiful and wonderful thing to be a man, not in spite of your sexuality and sexual desire, but in and because of it to a large extent. So that's something as kind of a parting word,
That's a
I
great parting
suppose.
word. I remember reading that part of your book and just pausing and saying, this is so good.
Mm,
Thank you.
thank you.
Well, let's let people know one more time about how to get the book and just a few other things, and we will conclude our conversation. The book we've been talking about is Non-Toxic Masculinity, available at InterVarsity Press, and the link is in the chat. And you can use the code ESN Web until May 2nd to get a 30% discount on the book, along with free shipping. Let me put that in there again. Also, we want to let you know just briefly about the next conversation, and we have information in the chat about that as well. Our guest in May is going to be Alan Noble, who's written a wonderful little, almost I guess a kind of a memoir that he titles On Getting Out of Bed, The Burden and Gift of Living. And sometimes getting out of bed itself, whether it's just the emotional challenges, sometimes the physical challenges of life, and the testimony of getting out of bed amid the great, the challenges of the world, is a powerful witness to the goodness of life and of God. And he's going to be talking about that. And you can register now for that if you're interested. It'll be May 17th at 1 p.m. Eastern time. And the URL is in the chat. And so we would love for you to have you join our next conversation. Finally, I just want to thank everyone for being here today. I really appreciate you taking out time to be a part of this conversation, and great questions that a number of you asked. We didn't get to every question here, but we really appreciate your engagement in the conversation. Special thanks to Zach for taking time out in the middle of a book launch to talk about that with us. We want to thank InterVarsity Press, who has works with us on coordinating many of these conversations, and for their role. This conversation was brought to you by the Emerging Scholars Network, and we would invite you to join the Emerging Scholars Network. There's no cost to do so. And you can just go to our website, which is blog.emergingscholars.org, and there's a join button that will take you through a quick questionnaire that allows you to join us and it will allow us basically to keep you posted about monthly events that the Emerging Scholars Network is doing. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at ESNIVCF. And I'd encourage you to visit and subscribe to our ESN channel on YouTube. That's just tiny. Actually, that address is incorrect. You can just go to we'll get the corrected address in the chat. That was one we were using for a while that does, I think, still work, but you can just go to youtube.com/ESNIVCF, and we'd invite you to subscribe to the channel. And this video, and we have about 40 plus others online there that you can watch and engage that way. So thank you so much for your time today. We'll be stopping recording in a moment, and you're welcome to hang out for a few minutes afterwards as well.